Let's be honest. When people hear the word weed, they probably think of modern times, tie-dye shirts, Bob Marley, and college dorms that smell like regret. But history, as usual, had already tried everything centuries before we thought we were being original. Because yes, even before medieval knights went jousting, someone somewhere was already getting high, not for fun exactly, but, you know, for spiritual purposes, or at least, that's what everyone says when they don't want to admit they're having fun. So today, we're diving into a surprisingly smoky corner of history, one where priests, kings, and probably a few bored farmers discovered that plants could do more than just feed you. Welcome to the boring, weird, and mildly suspicious story of how people started smoking weed long before the word weed even existed. If you've ever looked at ancient ruins and thought, wow, how did they even think of building that? There is a small chance the answer is they were experimenting. Long before the Middle Ages, before even the Roman Empire had its first toga party, ancient people in Central Asia were already burning certain green plants in little wooden bowls. Archaeologists found residue in these bowls charred, remains of cannabis mixed with aromatic herbs, dated to around 500 BC. That's right. While the Greeks were busy inventing democracy, someone in Asia was inventing aromatherapy with side effects. These early users weren't lighting up for a festival or a party. Most evidence suggests it was part of burial rituals. Imagine a priest standing over a tomb, smoke swirling dramatically, pretending it's for the gods. In reality, half the people there are probably coughing, and one guy is thinking, wait, I think I am the god. But here's the thing, they didn't even have a name for getting high. The language back then didn't have a word for stoned because everyone just assumed feeling weird during a ceremony was normal. By the time the nomadic warriors, famous for their horses and extremely questionable fashion, appeared around the same region, things escalated. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that the Scythians would crawl inside small tents, toss hemp seeds onto hot stones, and shout for joy, which, in modern terms, translates roughly to they got absolutely baked inside a sauna. Imagine a group of warriors, sweaty, sitting in a steaming tent filled with smoke, yelling happily for no reason. That's not a Viking metal concert. That's literally one of the earliest recorded hotbox sessions in human history. Now, the Scythians didn't think of this as recreation, they thought of it as purification, spiritual cleansing, connecting with the divine. But it's hard to take that seriously when the same people probably forgot where they parked their horses. Afterward, still, their rituals spread from Central Asia to Persia, and even to India, where cannabis became part of sacred traditions for thousands of years. In India, it was called bhang. Unlike the Scythians, who basically invented the medieval vape sauna, the Indians drank it mixed with milk and spices. It was smoother, calmer, and didn't require screaming inside a tent unless you spilled it. By the time Alexander the Great came storming through Asia, his army probably saw these rituals and thought, so that's what enlightenment smells like. By the time the medieval era rolled in, somewhere between knights getting rusty and peasants collecting, taxes for people they never met. Cannabis had already spread across continents like gossip at a royal banquet. In the East, it was medicine. In the West, it was mystery. And in between, it was both, depending on how badly your day was going. The ancient Chinese had written about hemp thousands of years, earlier mostly about its fiber for ropes, clothes, and paper, but tucked inside dusty medical texts. There's always that one sentence that sounds suspiciously like a party invite. In the Pensao Ching, the oldest Chinese pharmacopoeia, cannabis is described as a plant that can release the spirit and lighten the body. Now, if that's not poetic code for you'll feel amazing and maybe float a bit, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, in Persia, early Islamic scholars were conflicted. On one hand, the Quran forbade intoxication. On the other hand, someone found a plant that made long nights of meditation feel like flying through space. The result? They invented loopholes faster than theologians could close them. By the 12th century, hashish, the concentrated resin of cannabis, became famous in the Islamic world. The word itself comes from Arabic ashesh, meaning grass. It was cheaper than wine, easier to hide, and didn't leave you smelling like a vineyard exploded on you. Some Sufi mystics used it for spiritual focus, claiming it helped them reach divine states of consciousness. Others, well, they just enjoyed staring at walls for 3 hours. There's a fine line between spiritual enlightenment and forgetting what you were doing, and of course, there's the infamous story, probably exaggerated, about the assassins of Alamo, a mysterious medieval sect supposedly using hashish to recruit followers. According to legend, they drug new initiates, show them a lush garden full of food, women, and music, and then tell them, if you follow our leader, you'll return to this paradise forever, which is honestly the most effective marketing campaign in medieval history, even though historians now believe that story was propaganda, written by people who wanted to make Muslims look like lunatics. The word assassin literally came from hashish. So yes, every time someone in a video game says assassin, they're technically referencing stoned medieval murderers. Across the Mediterranean, hashish started drifting into Europe, mostly via traders, crusaders, and sailors, who definitely weren't reading the fine print of what they were importing. At first, Europeans used cannabis for rope and cloth, not realizing the fun part was in the flowers, not the fibers. But then came the herbalists, medieval doctors who somehow believed every disease could be cured with either a prayer, bloodletting, or something found behind the barn. They started noting cannabis as a remedy for headaches, gout, melancholy, and the vapors. Nobody knows what the vapors were, but given the context, it might just mean Monday. Still, it wasn't, until the Renaissance that Europeans began to notice what everyone else already knew: this plant could alter your mood faster than a sermon could put you to sleep. By the time the Middle Ages settled in, the age of castles, plagues, and suspiciously damp bread, Europe was ready for almost anything, except open-mindedness. Cannabis had already existed there for centuries, but most people saw it as just another boring crop. You could spin it into rope, weave it into fabric, or If you were particularly desperate, smoke it and blame the devil for whatever happened next. Unlike Asia or the Islamic world, Europe's relationship with weed was awkward. It's the historical equivalent of that one. Friend who insists they don't drink, but somehow ends up at every party anyway. Medieval monks cultivated hemp in monastery gardens, officially for making paper and clothes. But every historian knows that whenever something is described as strictly for medicinal use, it's probably not strictly medicinal. Still, the church had thoughts. In a society where sneezing too loudly could get you accused of witchcraft, plants that make you feel funny didn't exactly get good PR. Medical texts from the 13th century mentioned cannabis extracts for pain relief and sadness of the mind, which sounds like a poetic way of saying depression, but any suggestion that it could change perception or induce euphoria was carefully edited out. Because if there's one thing medieval Europe didn't like, it was fun. Meanwhile, folklore started turning cannabis and any other herb that caused unusual sensations into tools of witchcraft. Witches were said to brew flying, ointments that helped them soar. Through the night, modern historians think some of those ointments contained psychoactive plants including cannabis, belladonna, and henbane. So technically, the first people to get high in medieval Europe were being burned for it. The church didn't write public service announcements about drugs. They wrote sermons, and those sermons didn't say, "Don't do drugs," they said. "If you do, you'll dance with demons." Effective? Sure. Overkill? Absolutely. By the late medieval period, most of Europe forgot that cannabis could make you feel anything besides itchy rope burns. It stayed hidden in plain sight, growing quietly in fields, twisted into sails and sacks, while its more fun reputation faded into folklore and silence. But outside Europe, the story kept burning, literally. In India, cannabis was celebrated as sacred. In the Middle East, hashish clubs were forming. In China, physicians wrote of its healing and mind-expanding powers. And somewhere, a lonely European monk was still spinning hemp thread, completely unaware that his garden contained history's most controversial plant, because that's how history works. Sometimes the most ordinary thing around you turns out to be the most extraordinary. Once someone finally lights it on fire, the Middle Ages were not famous for chill people. If you've ever wondered what happens when society mixes religion, fear, and a complete lack of ventilation, well, welcome to medieval Europe. By the 12th century, the continent had already decided that almost everything pleasurable was suspicious. Dancing, sinful; laughing too loudly, sinful; eating meat on a Friday, straight to confession. So when someone discovered that certain plants could make you feel unusually relaxed, it was only a matter of time before someone else decided it must be the devil's work. Cannabis didn't start out as a threat. For centuries, hemp fields had covered Europe, providing ropes for ships, fibers for clothes, and oil for lamps. Every farmer grew it. Every kingdom taxed it. It was just another crop as ordinary as wheat. But the moment people realized it could also alter your perception, everything changed. The church wasn't thrilled about altered perception. Medieval Christianity revolved around obedience and order, your body, mind, and soul all belonged to God, and God did not approve of hallucinations that didn't come from divine visions. The earliest records of anti-drug sentiment came through the same institution that catalogued sins like pride and gluttony. The Church's moral manuals. In a 13th century manuscript from Germany, a monk wrote, "Those who use herbs to bring joy to the senses, they invite the demons of idleness into their hearts." Translation: if you enjoy yourself, demons move in rent-free. That sentiment spread like wildfire. Priests began preaching that unnatural pleasure, anything that wasn't tied to prayer or pain, corrupted the soul, and so began Europe's first moral panic. Cannabis itself wasn't singled out immediately. Most peasants didn't even know the plant could do anything unusual. But stories started circulating about strange brews and potions used by healers, herbal women, and night witches. The common thread, they all involved herbs that made the mind wander. The Inquisition took note. By the late 1400s, witch trials began to include accusations of using enchanted herbs to communicate with spirits, while most historians agree that cannabis was rarely the main ingredient. Plants like belladonna, mandrake, and henbane were far stronger. It didn't matter. Guilt by association was enough. If it made smoke, it made suspicion. Meanwhile, in Islamic territories like North Africa and the Middle East, hashish use was quietly thriving. In Cairo and Baghdad, cafes known as hashish houses offered relaxation and poetry instead of alcohol. European travelers returning from crusades sometimes mentioned these strange places, smoky rooms filled with laughter, music, and debates about God. To church authorities, this sounded like a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. The Council of Avignon in 1320 formally condemned the use of certain herbs that produce joy or forgetfulness and declared them an invention of Satan. No one mentioned cannabis by name, but everyone knew what was being talked about. And yet, ironically, medieval medicine continued to prescribe cannabis. Doctors used it for everything from toothaches to childbirth pain. Apothecaries stocked cannabis oil as a common remedy. Monks in monasteries copied medical texts that listed it right alongside sage and lavender. So how did they justify it? Simple, by changing the intention. If you used the plant to heal, it was medicine. If you used it to feel good, it was sin. Same leaf, different justification. But not everyone followed the rules. In the back streets of towns, among scholars, artists, and travelers, people whispered about the Eastern herb. Crusaders had seen it abroad. Merchants brought it home, often in small pouches hidden among spices. They said it could make music sound deeper, colors brighter, and thoughts feel like rivers. In a world dominated by cold stone churches and strict discipline, that kind of escape was irresistible. Of course, word got out. By the late 14th century, some church writers began warning about the intoxications of Saracen origin. Was their favorite word for Muslim, and intoxication was code for anything not approved by monks. So, in short, Europe had decided that getting high was foreign, and therefore dangerous. But as always, prohibition makes things more interesting. Secret circles of scholars, often those dabbling in alchemy and early science, experimented with herbs in private. They weren't looking for pleasure, they wanted knowledge. Figures like Paracelsus and Avicii wrote about how nature contained hidden spirits that could change the human mind. In their language, spirits meant essences, but to the church that sounded uncomfortably close to possession. Meanwhile, common people, farmers, midwives, soldiers, probably, still used cannabis, occasionally without even thinking of it as sinful. They grew it, they boiled it, they rubbed it on wounds. Sometimes they added it to wine or porridge, and if it made them laugh a little more than usual, well, maybe God just liked seeing them happy for once. But the church didn't agree. In the 15th century, Dominican friars began compiling lists of maleficious evil deeds committed by witches, among them burning herbs to call spirits, creating smoke that deceives the senses, and drinking potions that lift the mind from the body. It didn't take long before those descriptions began to look eerily like what we'd now call getting high. By the dawn of the Renaissance, cannabis had officially gone underground, not outlawed yet, but treated with deep suspicion. Europe had forgotten that hemp could heal, could soothe, could connect. Instead, it became another thing to fear, a symbol of temptation, laziness, and foreign corruption. The irony, while Europe condemned sinful smoke, its ships powered by hemp ropes and hemp sails were about to discover the new world, and those ships would bring back another plant destined to reshape history forever, tobacco. So yes, while medieval Europe was terrified of one plant that made people calm and peaceful, it was about to fall in love with another that made them addicted and cough for centuries. That's medieval logic for you. The age of discovery is often remembered for exploration, trade, and glorious expansion, which is a poetic way of saying a bunch of lost Europeans bumping into other people's land. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe suddenly decided the world was too small, so kings funded sailors, sailors got lost, and everyone else got new diseases. But amid all that chaos, one thing quietly changed human history forever: smoke. Yes, smoke. The thing that comes out of your campfire or your heretic neighbor's chimney. Only this time it came with marketing, because when European explorers stumbled into the Americas, they didn't just find gold, silver, and potatoes, they found tobacco, a plant that made people dizzy, happy, and addicted enough to build an empire. At first, they were confused. Christopher Columbus himself wrote in his journals that he saw men carrying fire in their hands and inhaling the smoke of certain burning leaves. He didn't understand it, but as always, the Europeans' first reaction to anything new was, "We should probably sell that." By the early 1500s, tobacco had crossed the Atlantic, and soon every European court was puffing away. Nobles smoked it for fashion. Doctors prescribed it for health, and poets smoked it for inspiration. Nobody actually liked the taste, but it made them feel sophisticated, which, to be fair, is the basis of 80% of human behavior. But here's the funny thing. while tobacco was becoming the world's first legal addiction. Another plant was sneaking along the same trade routes, the old one, the forgotten one, cannabis. Sailors used hemp to make ropes and sails, so ships practically ran on cannabis. Every voyage to the New World, every expedition, every pirate chase, all powered by hemp fibers. In a strange twist of irony, Europe was exploring the world using a plant they considered sinful. Soon, the Americas had both plants, tobacco for the lungs, hemp for the ropes. And for a while, both coexisted peacefully. But tobacco was flashier. It made money. Hemp just held things together. It was the responsible older sibling no one thanked. Still, travelers noticed something interesting. In parts of South America, shamans and healers used cannabis-like plants in their rituals, burning them, inhaling them, or mixing them with other herbs to see the spirit world. The reports reached Europe, where scholars started to whisper, maybe the old forbidden herbs weren't so evil after all. Maybe they were. Useful, but as usual, useful depended on who was talking. Doctors praised it. Priests condemned it. Merchants ignored both and sold it anyway. By the 1600s, Europe had divided its plants like a moral menu. Wine was holy. Tobacco was fashionable. Cannabis was suspicious. England, in particular, had a love-hate relationship with hemp. Queen Elizabeth, I literally ordered every landowner to grow hemp, not for smoking, but to supply ropes for her navy. So the same plant that was once called the devil's herb became a royal requirement. You had to grow it by law. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in the newly forming American colonies, hemp fields were everywhere. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both grew hemp, mostly industrial, not recreational, though one of Washington's diaries does mention he was sowing the seed at the right time to make it flower. Historians like to debate what he meant by that. But let's just say, if anyone deserved a chill moment after the Revolutionary War, it was him. Back in Europe, things got complicated. Doctors began experimenting again, distilling oils, mixing extracts, prescribing tinctures. The medical world rediscovered what ancient civilizations had known all along. Cannabis reduced pain, calmed nerves, and made insomnia disappear faster than a confession under torture. But every discovery comes with a backlash. Religious authorities still weren't ready to let go of centuries of suspicion. When people got too comfortable with mind-altering plants, preachers reminded them that true peace comes from God, not from herbs. It didn't help that hashish was still associated with the Muslim world, which Europeans viewed as morally dangerous and exotic. By the late 1600s, coffee and tobacco houses ruled Europe's social scene. Men in powdered wigs debated philosophy while swimming in nicotine and caffeine. The Enlightenment was practically sponsored by stimulants. Cannabis, on the other hand, remained in the apothecary in tiny glass jars labeled for melancholy, for sleep, for hysteria, and yet it refused to disappear. From India to the Ottoman Empire, it was celebrated. Artists painted with it. Poets wrote under its influence. Mystics meditated in fragrant smoke. In places like Cairo, Baghdad, and Istanbul, cannabis was not a vice, it was a culture. European travelers brought home stories of hashish clubs, where thinkers gathered to talk, dream, and argue, to the stiff collars of London and Paris. This sounded both scandalous and fascinating, because deep down, Europe loved sin as long as it came with good branding. By the end of the 17th century, cannabis had done the impossible. It had crossed every empire, every religion, every trade route. It had been worshipped, feared, banned, blessed, farmed, and smoked, sometimes all in the same century. But while the old world was busy judging it, the new world was quietly preparing its comeback. Because history has a sense of humor, the same sailors who carried hemp sails across the ocean would one day have descendants carrying joints in their pockets, and once again it all started with a spark. The 18th and 19th centuries were basically Europe's global shopping spree. Kings and queens sent ships everywhere, grabbed anything shiny, and declared it civilization. Spices, silk, sugar, tea, gold, if it could be traded or stolen, it was. And somewhere between the crates of coffee beans and boxes of jewels, there were bags of something green and crumbly that smelled suspiciously like curiosity. That's right. The plant that Europe once called sinful had just been rebranded as exotic. The British, French, and Dutch empires spread across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, regions where cannabis had been part of daily life for centuries. In India, people drank bhang during festivals, smoked ganja to relax, and used keras, a resin similar to hashish, for religious rituals. It was normal, about as ordinary as tea. So, of course, when the British showed up, they immediately took notes, made judgments, and wrote long reports about how the natives appear unusually cheerful. In other words, they noticed people were happy and decided it was a problem. Early colonial doctors and administrators started studying cannabis with the same energy they studied everything else, with a pen in one hand and superiority in the other. They described it as the intoxicant of the Orient, the poor man's solace and the cause of laziness among natives. In their minds, everything they didn't understand could be explained by either climate or moral weakness. But the truth was, Europeans were fascinated. British soldiers stationed in India tried bhang during festivals and quickly discovered it made colonial life slightly more tolerable. They wrote home about it. Some even brought samples back to London under the label Indian hemp. It sounded respectable, mysterious, scientific, everything the Victorians loved. By the 1800s, European apothecaries began selling cannabis indica extracts as medicine. Bottles of tinctures appeared in pharmacies across London, Paris, and Berlin. They were prescribed for insomnia, migraines, and female troubles, which was the polite term for everything. Doctors didn't understand the irony. The same governments that taxed hashish in colonies were now selling it in glass bottles with fancy labels back home. Empire wasn't just about conquering people. It was about packaging their habits and calling it progress. Meanwhile, in Egypt and North Africa, hashish use had become a social pastime, smoked in cafes. Alongside coffee and conversation, European travelers loved to write about it, usually in judgmental tones. One French officer wrote, the natives of Cairo indulge in the smoke of hashish, which renders them calm, slow, and dreamy, unfit for productive labor, which, coming from a man sitting in a cafe all afternoon writing about other people, was peak hypocrisy. Still, the fascination grew. Writers and artists, always the first to try something weird, began experimenting. In 1840s Paris, a group of poets and painters formed Le Club des Hashish, the Club of the Hashish. They met in a Gothic hotel room, wore robes, ate hashish-laced sweets, and discussed art, philosophy, and life while floating through clouds of fragrant smoke. Among them were Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, and Victor Hugo. Yes, the guy who wrote Les Miserables was probably high when he imagined half of it. Baudelaire described the experience as a paradise artificial, where time ceases and the soul dances freely. Translation: he had a great time and wanted to sound smart about it. But as usual, what artists loved, politicians feared. By the mid-19th century, European colonial reports began to frame cannabis as a dangerous native drug. British officials in India worried it made soldiers too. Relaxed French authorities in Algeria claimed it caused madness and rebellion. When colonial subjects laughed, it looked suspicious. When they protested, it looked dangerous. So governments did what governments always do. They blamed the plant. In 1894, the British set up one of history's strangest bureaucratic committees, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission. For a year, they interviewed hundreds of doctors, priests, soldiers, farmers, and users about cannabis. The final report was massive, 7 volumes, over 3,000 pages, all to answer one question: should we ban it? The conclusion: no. The commission declared cannabis was not a social danger, not addictive, and not a threat to health. It was, in their words, a habit of moderate indulgence, comparable to that of alcohol in the West. So what did Britain do? They ignored it. Because history loves irony, and empires love hypocrisy. Back in Europe, the Oriental image of cannabis grew more romantic. Painters depicted dreamy Middle Eastern figures surrounded by cushions and hooks. Novelists described mysterious travelers bringing Indian hemp to foggy London. It became a symbol of both fear and fascination, the West's favorite contradiction. And beneath all the moral panic and pseudoscience, cannabis was quietly becoming part of Western medicine. Pharmaceutical companies, yes, the same ones still around today, started mass-producing cannabis tinctures. It was prescribed for epilepsy, appetite loss, depression, even labor pain. Queen Victoria's personal physician reportedly used it to ease her menstrual cramps, which means, technically, one of the most powerful women in history might have been chilling on royal weed. But while Victorian pharmacies were busy bottling it, colonial bureaucrats were banning it. In Egypt, hashish was outlawed in 1877 under pressure from European powers. In India, taxes and restrictions increased. And in Africa, missionaries called it the herb of idleness, linking it to moral decay. So while Europeans smoked cigars in their clubs and drank brandy until dawn, they told everyone else their version of relaxation was uncivilized. That's empire logic in a nutshell. Our drugs are culture. Yours are corruption. By the turn of the 20th century, the world had been neatly divided, modern nations with tobacco and alcohol, and backward colonies with hashish and opium. And as industrialization spread, governments began regulating pleasure itself. What used to be sacred ritual or harmless relaxation was now called vice. The modern war on drugs hadn't started yet, but its propaganda machine was already warming up. Still, the plant endured, from temples in India to cafes in Cairo, from apothecaries in London to jazz bars in New Orleans. Cannabis kept slipping through every cultural boundary, too useful to kill, too ancient to forget. Empires came and went, trade routes shifted, flags changed, but the smoke somehow always stayed. Because no matter how many kings tried to control it, no matter how many reports were written, one thing remained true. People have always looked for something to make life a little easier to bear. Sometimes it's prayer, sometimes it's music, and sometimes it's a plant that's been growing quietly beside us for 10,000 years. By the early 20th century, humanity had achieved many things: steam engines, electricity, and the ability to ruin anything fun by passing laws against it. For thousands of years, cannabis had been medicine, ritual, rope, and recreation. But now, as the world entered the modern era, it was about to meet its deadliest enemy: bureaucracy. The story begins in the United States because, of course it does. In the late 1800s, cannabis was a respectable part of American medicine. Every pharmacy carried cannabis indica tincture imported from India, sold in brown glass bottles with neat labels promising relief from pain, insomnia, and anxiety. It was legal, common, and completely uncontroversial. Doctors prescribed it for nervous conditions and hysteria, which, in medical terms, meant we have no idea what's wrong. But this might help. Even the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the official book of drugs, listed cannabis as a trusted remedy. Then came the 1900s, and with it, a new obsession: control. Governments around the world were realizing that people enjoyed mind-altering substances, so they decided to protect citizens from themselves, one law at a time. Opium regulated, cocaine taxed, alcohol about to be banned, and cannabis, sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly looked suspicious. The problem wasn't science. It was immigration. After the Mexican Revolution 1910, thousands of Mexican workers crossed into the U.S., bringing their culture, music, and you guessed it, marijuana. They smoked it socially, like people everywhere else had done for centuries. But in early 20th century America, anything foreign was automatically dangerous. Newspapers began running sensational stories about killer weed. They claimed marijuana caused madness, violence, and moral decay. Headlines screamed, "Mexican drug causes insanity. Marijuana, the assassin of youth. Reefer makes devils of men." If it sounds ridiculous, that's because it was. But propaganda doesn't need truth, just fear. And in the 1930s, America had plenty of that. Enter Harry Ansel, the first commissioner of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a man who looked at cannabis and saw not a plant, but a career opportunity. Anslinger launched one of the most successful smear campaigns in history. He testified before Congress that marijuana made men lust for blood, turned women into addicts of Negro jazz, and caused degeneracy and madness. Yes, that's a real quote. No, he was not joking. In reality, the campaign wasn't about health, it was about racism and control. Cannabis was associated with Mexican immigrants, black jazz musicians, and working-class communities. The same plant white doctors had prescribed for decades was suddenly the devil's harvest, and people believed it, because people always believe whatever lets them feel superior. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act passed, effectively criminalizing cannabis in the US. It wasn't a full ban. You just had to pay a special tax and get a license to possess it. The catch: the government refused to issue licenses. So overnight, a harmless medicine became a criminal offense. Pharmaceutical companies quietly removed cannabis from their products. Doctors stopped prescribing it. The US Pharmacopoeia deleted it from their listings in 1942. History had officially gone up in smoke. But America didn't stop there. Once prohibition started, it needed justification. So came the propaganda film Reefer Madness, 1936. Melodramatic masterpiece showing teenagers smoking marijuana, going insane, committing murder, and dying horribly. The acting was terrible, but the message worked. The world followed. After World War II, US influence expanded globally, and so did its drug policy. International treaties like the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961 lumped cannabis together with heroin and cocaine. Nations were pressured to outlaw it, destroy crops, and punish users. The same plant once worshipped in temples, sold in apothecaries, and used by queens was now contraband. By the 1950s and 60s, police were raiding homes, burning fields, and locking up users. But here's the twist. Every time governments tried to kill cannabis, it just got cooler. Because the 1960s happened, the counterculture, hippies, musicians, artists, and students discovered weed and declared it their symbol of rebellion. They didn't care about laws. They cared about freedom. So they smoked in public, sang about peace, and annoyed every conservative politician alive. Songs like Purple Haze, Rainy Day Women, and One Toke Over the Line turned weed from taboo to icon. For the first time, getting high wasn't just a private act, it was political. Anslinger and his successors called it a national threat, but by then it was too late. You can outlaw plants, but you can't outlaw curiosity. Meanwhile, scientists began revisiting cannabis not as a vice, but as a mystery. In 1964, Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam isolated THC, the compound responsible for the plant's psychoactive effects. He and his team discovered the body's natural endocannabinoid system, meaning humans were biologically wired to interact with the plant. In other words, nature had built us to enjoy it. Bureaucracy just got in the way, but science couldn't undo decades of fear overnight. The war on drugs of the 1970s doubled down on punishment. Not understanding, US President Richard Nixon declared drugs public enemy number one, even while his own advisors later admitted the policy was designed to target hippies and black people, funding for research dried up. Jails filled up. Lives were destroyed, not by the plant, but by the laws. And yet, the weed kept growing, in basements, attics, and fields hidden under corn. People cultivated what governments condemn. They bred new strains, shared seeds, and turned cannabis into a global underground network. By the 1990s, the cracks started showing. Medical patients, especially those with cancer, epilepsy, and AIDS, began pushing for legalization. They argued that cannabis relieved pain and nausea better than pharmaceuticals. And this time, science backed them up. One by one, U.S. states legalized medical marijuana. Then came recreational legalization in places like Colorado, Canada, and the Netherlands. The same countries that once called it dangerous were now taxing it like alcohol and making billions. Somewhere, Harry Anslinger was probably rolling in his grave. By the 21st century, cannabis had gone from sacred herb to scandalous crime to billion-dollar business. Corporations now sold it in sleek packaging with minimalist logos and wellness branding. It wasn't the devil's harvest anymore. It was a lifestyle product. But here's the thing about history. It doesn't move in straight lines. It loops. Every era thinks it's inventing something new, when it's really rediscovering something ancient. The medieval monk growing hemp behind his abbey and the modern entrepreneur running a cannabis startup. They're basically the same guy, both just trying to make a living off something green. The only difference is that now it's legal in some countries, and still a death sentence in others. Because despite all the science, profits, and social change, the world remains divided. Some see cannabis as medicine, some see it as sin, and some, quietly, just see it as a way to breathe a little easier in a world that never stops, tightening its grip. That's the tragedy and comedy of modern history. We built empires on trade, economies on crops, and wars on fear. And after 10,000 years, humans are still arguing over a plant that just wants sunlight, water, and peace. By the time the 21st century arrived, humanity had invented smartphones, space tourism, and 10 different ways to make avocado toast. But our relationship with weed still complicated. After nearly a century of fear, propaganda, and prison sentences, something strange happened. People started realizing that maybe the plant wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was how humans kept reacting to it. From criminal to commodity, in the early 2000s, the tone began to shift. The same governments that had declared cannabis public enemy number one were now running studies about its potential therapeutic benefits. It was like watching. Your strict Aunt Who once said, tattoos were the mark of the devil suddenly. Show up with a butterfly on her ankle. Medical marijuana became the gateway to mainstream acceptance. Patients suffering from chronic pain, epilepsy, and cancer began testifying that cannabis wasn't just helping, it was the only thing that helped. Doctors who once whispered the word marijuana now prescribed it openly. Politicians who once denounced it now called it a public health issue. And the first to smell profits started, showing up in hem-colored suits with PowerPoint slides about market opportunity. The cannabis industry was born, and it looked nothing like its underground past. No more joints in basements. No more sketchy dealers in parking lots. Now it was dispensaries with names like Greenleaf Wellness and Cloud9 Botanicals, decorated with reclaimed wood, potted succulents, and soft jazz playing in the background. The product, no longer just weed. Now it was curated experience. You could buy pre-rolled microdosed joints, organic CBD oils, vegan edibles, and gummies shaped like smiley faces that cost more than lunch. Each product came with sleek typography and phrases like elevate your mood or find your calm. In other words, the same plant that once got people arrested was now being sold by people wearing linen shirts and saying namaste. It was capitalism's favorite trick. Take something poor people go to jail for, rebrand it as wellness, and sell it back to rich people for $40 a gram. The global green rush. By the 2010s, legalization spread faster than a TikTok trend. Canada went fully legal in 2018. Dozens of US states followed. Uruguay became the first country to legalize nationwide. Suddenly, what was once contraband became the next billion-dollar industry. Wall Street called it the Green Rush. Investors poured millions into cultivation startups, biotech labs, and luxury weed brands. Magazine covers featured CEOs holding hemp leaves like trophies. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, especially people who'd never actually rolled one. But as the money flowed in, history repeated itself. The people who suffered under prohibition, mostly black and Latino, communities were rarely the ones getting rich now. Licensing laws favored corporations, not the individuals once punished for the same trade. For many, legalization wasn't justice. It was just gentrification with a smile. Still, public opinion kept shifting. Weed wasn't just medicine anymore, it was identity. Weed as lifestyle. Somewhere along the way, cannabis became cool again. It wasn't about rebellion like in the 1960s. It was about aesthetic. Influencers posted photos of perfectly rolled joints next to oat milk CBD bath bombs promised mindful relaxation. Luxury brands launched infused skincare lines with vague claims about ancient botanical balance. Celebrities jumped in too. Rappers sold branded blunts. Actresses launched CBD beauty products. Even Martha Stewartius, the queen of table settings, released a line of cannabis gummies for graceful living. And when Snoop Dogg partnered with her, the universe basically completed a circle that no philosopher could have predicted. What was once forbidden had become fashionable. You could buy cannabis candles, infused olive oil, dog treats, even yoga retreats promising spiritual detox with plant medicine. Somehow, smoking weed had turned into a lifestyle choice that came with a subscription box. But for every glossy ad and wellness blog, there were still countries where the same act meant prison or worse. The uneven revolution. In parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, cannabis remains a serious crime. People are still jailed or executed for possessing it, even as Western nations build luxury dispensaries. The irony is exhausting. The global South grows it. The global North profits from it. In Thailand, once notorious for strict drug laws, cannabis was suddenly legalized. For medical use in 2022, then semi-restricted again because the government panicked at how quickly people embraced it. In Singapore or Saudi Arabia, possession can still lead to severe punishment. Meanwhile, across Europe and North America, cannabis cafes are opening next to juice bars. The world's moral compass is spinning like a cheap compass on a pirate ship. Science versus stigma. Despite all the chaos, research has finally caught up with folklore. Scientists have discovered that the cannabis plant contains over 1 cannabinoids, each with unique effects on the brain and body. CBD, once ignored, became the new superstar. The part of the plant that doesn't get you high, but somehow gets you sponsored by Goop. Studies suggest cannabis may help with anxiety, chronic pain, and PTSD. But because it's still illegal in many places, research remains limited. We've known the plant for 10,000 years, and we're only now allowed to study it properly. That's humanity in a nutshell, discovering fire, then spending millennia arguing about who's allowed to use it. The politics of pleasure. Even as legalization expands, debates rage on. Supporters argue it's safer than alcohol, less addictive, and medically beneficial. Opponents warn about addiction, mental health, and moral decay. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the haze. Cannabis isn't harmless, but it's not the monster governments made it out to be. It's a tool like wine, coffee, or Twitter, capable of connection, creativity, or chaos, depending on who's using it and how often. But the modern world doesn't like moderation. It likes branding. So cannabis became not just a substance, but a symbol of freedom, rebellion, healing, or capitalism. Depending on the context, it's no longer just a plant, it's a mirror, and what you see in it says more about you than about the plant itself. The irony of progress. We've reached a strange point in history. A person can walk into a glass-walled dispensary in Los Angeles, buy a jar of premium Sunset sherbet for $80 and pay taxes on it, while another person a few hundred miles away still sits in prison for selling the same thing in 1999. Governments now profit from what they once punished. Corporations market plant wellness, while activists who fought for legalization struggle to get business licenses. History doesn't erase itself. It just rebrands. The future is still smoky. Looking ahead, the cannabis industry continues to grow, pun intended. New technologies promise personalized strains, nano-emulsified drinks, and AI-assisted cultivation. Systems that sound way more complicated than a plant should ever need. But the real question isn't whether cannabis will keep spreading. It's whether humanity will finally learn to treat it with balance instead of obsession. Because after 10 millennia, one thing's clear. Weed has never been just about weed. It's about how societies define pleasure, sin, and control. We've used the same plant to pray, to heal, to party, and to punish. We've called it sacred, evil, medical, illegal, profitable, and trendy, often all at once. And in 1,000 years, when historians look back at our era, they won't see the cannabis revolution. They'll just see another chapter in humanity's endless attempt to control the uncontrollable, our desire to feel something beyond ourselves. Because deep down, whether in an ancient temple or a California dispensary, the reason hasn't changed. People light up for the same reason they always have: to quiet the noise, to remember they're alive, and to find, even for a moment, a little peace. By now, you'd think humanity would have learned its lesson. After 10,000 years of smoking, brewing, banning, rediscovering, and rebranding cannabis, you'd imagine the story would finally be over. But no, because if history teaches us anything, it's that humans never let peace get in the way of politics. The so-called war on drugs may have started in the 20th century, but its ghost still haunts the 21st. And like every good ghost, it refuses to die, mostly because it's too profitable to disappear. Act 1. The war becomes a business. The modern drug war wasn't just moral panic, it was a full-blown economic strategy. When US President Richard Nixon declared drugs public enemy number one in 1971, he didn't create a moral crusade. He created an industry. Billions of dollars were poured into police budgets, prisons, border control, and propaganda. An entire generation of politicians got elected on the promise of law and order. Behind the speeches, the logic was simple. Fear is good business. Scared citizens vote for strong governments. Strong governments fund enforcement agencies, and enforcement agencies always need new enemies to stay relevant. Cannabis became the perfect villain, visible, smellable, and easy to arrest. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies, who made billions selling legal drugs, quietly supported anti-cannabis laws. Because why let people grow pain, relief in their backyard, when you could sell it in pills for $300 a bottle? And so, what started as a moral issue turned into a global machine powered by money, fear, and hypocrisy. Act 2. Exporting the crusade. Once America declared war, the rest of the world was invited or pressured to join. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, US diplomats pushed anti-drug treaties that forced countries to criminalize cannabis or risk losing trade deals and aid. It was moral imperialism dressed as cooperation. In Latin America, billions were spent on eradication. Campaigns, soldiers burning fields of cannabis and coca under the hot sun, while helicopters hovered above like mosquitoes of justice. Governments called it progress. Farmers called it Tuesday. The US sent money, weapons, and advisors to enforce prohibition, and in return, God called itself the leader of the free world. The result? Millions arrested, trillions spent, zero plants eliminated. If anything, the war made cannabis stronger. Literally, growers adapted, bred new, more potent strains, and moved indoors. The black market thrived under pressure. It was Darwinism, but for drug dealers. Act 3. Politics, power, and pretending to care. By the 1990s, the war on drugs had created a new political language. Words like crack epidemic and zero tolerance filled headlines. And while cannabis was nowhere near as destructive as other drugs, it was treated the same way because nuance doesn't win elections. In the US, entire communities, mostly black and Latino, were targeted under tough on crime policies. Possessing a few grams could mean years in prison. Meanwhile, CEOs were laundering billions through offshore accounts and getting community service. The drug war wasn't just about drugs. It was about control. And the hypocrisy ran deep. Politicians publicly condemned weed while privately investing in alcohol, and tobacco companies, media, moguls ran anti-drug campaigns between commercials for whiskey and cigarettes. Religious leaders called it immoral, then collected donations from pharmaceutical giants. It was less about protecting people and more about protecting systems. Act 4. Science versus the script. As research finally began revealing the medical benefits of cannabis, from treating epilepsy to easing PTSD, governments found themselves cornered. They couldn't deny the evidence anymore. But admitting the truth meant admitting they'd been wrong for 80 years. And politics never apologizes. So instead, they stalled. Bureaucrats formed committees. Committees formed studies. Studies formed working groups. And working groups concluded that further research is needed. Translation, we'll talk about it again in another decade. Meanwhile, patients kept suffering, and pharmaceutical companies developed synthetic THC products, patentable, expensive, and somehow acceptable. The same politicians who once said weed was dangerous now approved lab-made versions of it. As long as someone could make a profit, that's not progress. That's a rerun. Act 5, the prison problem. The war on drugs didn't just criminalize plants, it industrialized punishment. In the US alone, millions were imprisoned for non-violent drug offenses, including cannabis possession. Private prisons, yes, the ones that make money off inmate populations, lobbied to keep it that way. More prisoners meant more profits. Even after legalization in several states, thousands remained behind bars for doing what's now a legal business. Some of them even watched on prison TVs as celebrities launched million-dollar weed brands. That's not irony. That's dystopia with better lighting. And it wasn't just America. Across the world, similar laws filled jails, drained budgets, and devastated communities, all for a plant that grows wild in ditches. Act 6. The Global Divide. By the 2010s, the world split into two realities. In one, people lined up outside dispensaries holding loyalty cards. In the other, people were still being executed for possession. In countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia, drug laws remained medieval. Literally, even tiny amounts of cannabis could mean the death penalty. Meanwhile, Canada's cannabis industry was worth billions. Investors toasted with THC champagne while activists in other nations hid their plants under floorboards. It's the same story empire told centuries ago, just rewritten with modern language. Back then, Europe banned native drugs while exporting its own. Now, the West profits from weed while telling the rest of the world to catch up responsibly. The hypocrisy hasn't gone anywhere. It just learned to use PowerPoint. Act 7. The war evolves. The thing about wars is that they never really end. They just change names. Today's war on drugs looks cleaner. Less fire and brimstone, more policy and PR. Governments talk about responsible regulation and public safety. But the mindset that the state must control pleasure hasn't changed. Even in countries where weed is legal, it's still tightly regulated. You can smoke it, but not too much. Grow it, but not too many. Sell it, but only if you're rich enough to get a license. It's not freedom, it's permission. And that's how politics keeps the war alive, by pretending it's over. Act 8, why it still matters. So why does this fight keep going? Because cannabis, like every social issue, isn't really about the thing itself. It's about what it represents. To conservatives, it's a threat to order. To liberals, it's a symbol of progress. To corporations, it's a market. And to the average person, it's just a plant that helps them sleep. But the debate keeps spinning because no one wants to admit the truth. That prohibition was never about health or safety or morality. It was about fear. And fear is the easiest resource to mine. You can't tax morality, but you can build an entire economy around punishing it. Act 9, the quiet rebellion. Still, history has a funny way of outlasting politics. Every ban eventually becomes a joke. Every war eventually loses steam. And while the official war drags on, millions of people quietly choose to ignore it. Farmers plant, scientists study, users smoke. Every puff, every seed, every lab result is an act of peaceful rebellion against a system that mistakes control for civilization. The truth is, the war didn't fail. It succeeded at what it was designed to do, not to stop drugs, but to manage people. And yet, despite all that, the plant keeps growing. It doesn't care about borders or bans. It doesn't march, vote, or tweet. It just grows. Because nature doesn't negotiate. Epilogue, the war ends when we're bored. Maybe the war will end someday, not with a treaty, but with a shrug. Humans tend to get tired of fighting the inevitable. One day, cannabis will be fully legal almost everywhere. Not because of activism or enlightenment, but because politicians will realize they can make more money taxing it than banning it. That's how all wars end, not with justice, but with profit. And when that day comes, we'll celebrate like it's progress, forgetting, once again, that the plant never changed. Only the story around it did. The war will finally be over, but the joke will always be the same. A species that can split the atom and land on. The moon still can't decide what to do with a flower. There's a strange comfort in knowing that across thousands of years, across continents and empires, human beings have never really changed. We invent gods, build cities, start wars, and then, when it all becomes too much, we get high. It doesn't really matter how smoke, brew, chew, drink, inhale, or pray. It's all the same story told in different languages. Every civilization, no matter how advanced or primitive, eventually finds its own way to escape consciousness for a while. And then it gives it a fancy name, ritual, medicine, spiritual enlightenment, recreation, but deep down, it's all the same thing. Humans trying to make reality a little softer around the edges. Act 1, the first spark. Long before cannabis had names, before governments or borders, someone somewhere found a plant that made them feel less tired of being alive. We'll never know who that first person was. Maybe a herder watching sheep in ancient Central Asia. Maybe a priest in a dark temple somewhere in Mesopotamia. But that moment that first spark became the beginning of an unending cycle. They probably didn't call it weed. They probably just called it magic. They lit it, breathed it, and stared into the fire. And for a brief, perfect moment, they felt the universe breathe back. That's how it started. Not with rebellion or pleasure, but with curiosity. And curiosity, more than anything else, is what makes humans human. Act 2. The civilized high. As societies grew, the high became an institution. Egypt had wine and lotus. India had soma. China had tea. The Greeks had philosophy and an amphora of something fermented. The medieval world had ale, incense, and cannabis tinctures hidden in monasteries. Every time humanity became civilized, it found a respectable excuse to stay a little buzzed. Kings drank in chalices. Monks inhaled in silence. Peasants smoked in fields. Everyone participated, even if they pretended otherwise. Because civilization doesn't erase desire, it just gives it better packaging. And so, the eternal cycle evolved. First comes discovery, then joy, then control, then guilt, then rediscovery again. Over and over. It's practically a law of history. Act 3, the fall and the ban. But somewhere along the line, pleasure became suspicious. Religions rose. Empires tightened. Morality became currency. What used to be sacred turned into sin. What used to be medicine became contraband. People still got high, of course, just in secret. They whispered, traded, grew in shadows. Because no empire, no church, no government has ever managed to outlaw human curiosity. For every ruler who banned a substance, there were 10 farmers who ignored them. For every priest who preached purity, there was an apothecary selling miracle tonics in unmarked bottles. The story of prohibition isn't about stopping use. It's about shifting it underground, about pretending control is possible. But control is an illusion, and history has never been kind to illusions. Act 4, the modern return. Fast forward a few thousand years, and here we are again, rediscovering the same plant our ancestors already understood. We call it progress, but it's more like déjà vu. Science now confirms what ancient medicine already knew, that cannabis can heal, soothe, and calm. We've just replaced shamans with scientists, temples with clinics, and incense with dispensaries. The irony is beautiful. We banned the plant for being primitive, only to come back to it wearing lab coats. Now we label it, tax it, brand it, and post it on Instagram with minimalist packaging. We call it wellness, because getting high doesn't sound professional enough for LinkedIn. But underneath the corporate gloss, it's the same leaf, the same smoke, the same search for peace in a noisy world. Act 5, the economics of escape. Every age finds a way to commercialize escape. In the ancient world, it was temples selling blessings. In the modern one, it's startups selling gummies. And somewhere in between, kings, priests, and politicians all learned the same lesson. You can't stop people from chasing euphoria, but you can make them pay for it. That's how sin became one of the world's most profitable industries. We tax alcohol. We regulate tobacco. We ban some drugs and legalize others, not based on danger, but on profit margin. Even now, as weed becomes mainstream, the same cycle repeats. Small growers struggle while corporations patent strains, license branding, and sell artisanal relaxation for $49.99. It's not a revolution. It's just capitalism in tie-dye. Act 6. The memory of the plant. Plants don't hold grudges. If you burn one, it grows back. If you ban one, it waits. Cannabis has outlived kingdoms, religions, and entire civilizations. It doesn't care who's in charge. It just grows, quietly, persistently, stubbornly. It's seen the rise of emperors and the fall of empires. It's crossed oceans, survived wars, and adapted to basements with grow lights. Humans forget. Plants remember. And maybe that's why it fascinates us so much, because deep down we envy its resilience. We destroy everything we touch, but the weed always returns. It's not defiance, it's just existence. Act 7. The universal pattern. Every civilization reaches a point where it realizes something uncomfortable. Reality is exhausting. So it builds an escape hatch. Wine, weed, opium, television, social media. Different tools, same purpose. Ancient priests used smoke to talk to gods. Modern people use smoke to forget about work. Different temples, same prayers. And the cycle goes like this. Discovery, use, control, denial, rediscovery. It's the heartbeat of human culture. We can change our tools, our gods, our governments, but we can't change the fundamental need to alter consciousness. It's built into our species. It's our most human impulse to reach beyond the ordinary, even for a moment. Act 8. The irony of enlightenment. We call ourselves enlightened now. We have satellites, AI, and quantum computers. We can map the stars and edit DNA. And yet, the same creature that discovered fire still lights herbs to feel something ancient and unexplainable. Maybe enlightenment was never about escaping the high. Maybe it was about understanding it. Because in the end, all these rituals, laws, wars, and rediscoveries tell one quiet truth. We don't get high because we're weak. We get high because we're aware. To aware, the human mind was never built to handle eternity, pain and taxes all at once. So we build small exits in smoke, in prayer, in music, in art, tiny doorways to remind ourselves we're still alive. And for that, the universe doesn't punish us. It probably nods in agreement. Act 9. The cycle continues. Maybe 1,000 years from now, some historian will write a boring video script about how people in the 21st century smoked, vaped, and argued online about legalization, and they'll sound as detached as we do now talking about ancient shamans with clay pipes, because the future will have its own high, something new, something banned, something rediscovered. Maybe it won't even be a substance. Maybe it'll be a simulation, a sound, a feeling programmed into our brains. But the story will be the same. Curiosity, joy, guilt, control, and return. The only constant is the cycle. The characters just change costumes. Epilogue, the flower that outlasted time. And so, the story of cannabis isn't really about cannabis. It's about us, the restless, anxious, endlessly curious species that can't stop chasing meaning, even in a puff of smoke. The plant didn't evolve to please us. We evolved to seek it, because in its quiet, stubborn existence, it mirrors our own, fragile, adaptable, and yearning to feel something beyond survival. Maybe that's why, across millennia, across languages, we keep coming back to it. Not as rebels, not as addicts, but as travelers looking for a brief rest before returning to the chaos of being human. And maybe, if there's one eternal truth to this entire boring history, it's this. Every age thinks it's modern. Every society thinks it's civilized. And every generation eventually gets high. So, in the end, the story of weed isn't about drugs. It's about people doing what people always do. Discover something, ban it. Rediscover it, and call it progress. We call it history. But it's really just the same joke told over thousands of years. With different outfits, this was boring history, where nothing really changes, except the way we describe it